My name is Jessica Keating, and I am the Director of the Office of Human Dignity and Life Initiatives, a joint initiative between the Office of the President and the McGrath Institute for Church Life. And I'm pleased to welcome you all here Saturday morning on behalf of our Director, John Cavadini, who is attending the American Academy of Religion Conference in San Antonio this weekend. He sends his greetings and thanks you all for coming out on this rainy and snowy morning, a perfect South Bend morning, to celebrate our last home football game of the season and our final Saturday with the Saints, and to bid farewell to autumn. Because if you were here yesterday, you know that the temperature has dropped 35 degrees in the last 18 hours. And even though it is sunny and 65 in San Antonio, Professor Cavadini, I'm sure, wishes he were here to spend the morning with all of you. You know, sometimes it seems like in our world, in our communities, and even our church, are worth less than the sum of our divisions and disagreements. We can forget to attend to what is most beautiful, most inspiring, and most noble. The McGrath Institute for Church Life is Notre Dame's outreach to the church, nourishing the Catholic imagination with the beauty of love incarnate. Across the country and even across the world, we work with dioceses and schools to form Catholic leaders to serve the church and their communities, to address pressing pastoral challenges with theological depth and rigor, to be lights shining in the darkness. We work with young people over the summer to help them form the disposition of listening to God and to responding to his call to form deeper and deeper relationship with him through his Son, Jesus Christ. We engage in research and inquiry that assists bishops in thinking through pastoral challenges and possible solutions and responses. We form leaders in catechesis who minister throughout the country, spreading the joy of the gospel in parishes and schools. We work with teachers of science and religion to heal the false perception among young people that somehow science and religion are incompatible. We nourish the imaginations of liturgical ministers, musicians, and priests with the riches of the tradition, with the love of the Word made flesh, who so loved the world that he became man and walked among us. And we sponsor events like this, Saturday with the Saints, which gathers 150 or so every home football game to encounter the beauty and witness of the saints. As Professor Cavadini always says, the saints emerge from the life of the church, but they are not for the church alone. They are a gift to all the world. They inspire us. They unsettle us. They remind us what it means to be human. The saints are those men and women who stretch our imaginations, who communicate the mysteries of faith through the very medium of their lives. The saints, as Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI said when he was still Joseph Ratzinger, are those men and women whose, quote, minds probe deeper than the slogans of the day, who see more than others see because their lives embrace a wider reality, end quote. They are flames of love and mercy in a world that often seems merciless, and shrouded in darkness. The saints show us what it means to listen to God, who doesn't shout with the slogans of the day, but whispers to us, woos us with patient love. On this, the eve of the close of the year of mercy, we will consider the life of Saint Elizabeth of Hungary, wife, mother, and queen, whose feast day is today across Europe and was Thursday in America. I am happy to introduce this morning's speaker, Father Terence Ehrman, a Holy Cross priest who is the Assistant Director for Life Sciences Research and Outreach of the Center of Theology, Science, and Human Flourishing at the University of Notre Dame, where he investigates the relationship between theology and science, particularly ecology and evolution. Appropriately, Father Terry teaches a course in our Department of Theology called Science, Theology, and Creation that explores understanding who God is as creator, who we are as creatures, and what our relationship is to God, ourselves, and the natural world. Father Terry was ordained a priest in the year 2000 after receiving a Bachelor in Science in Biology and his Master of Divinity at the University of Notre Dame. He also completed a Master of Science in Aquatic Ecology from Virginia Tech and received his PhD in Systematic Theology from the Catholic University of America. Perhaps most importantly, though, Father Terry hails from Baltimore, Maryland, and like me, is a beleaguered Orioles fan in this year of the Cubs. Though unlike me, he might remember their last World Series win.
I do. It's in high school.
He has published articles in a wide variety of publications, including the Jesuit Weekly America magazine, Theology and Science, New Blackfriars, Freshwater Biology, Methods in Stream Ecology, and the Journal of the North American Benthological Society. And if you aren't quite sure what the Benthological Society is, I can assure you you're not alone. So as you can see, Father Terry is a man of many talents. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Father Terry Ehrman, who will nourish our imaginations with the witness of St. Elizabeth of Hungary, wife, mother, queen, and champion of mercy.
Thank you, Jess, and welcome to all Hokie fans who are here. I actually have the pleasure and honor to be hosting my master's advisor from Virginia Tech. He and his wife are in the back of the room. So he gave a talk yesterday on campus on streams and nitrogen. And also welcome to those who have come from near and far, especially we have a Hungarian in our midst, Gisela, who is here. She was born in Hungary. She has the name of the wife of the first Catholic king of Hungary, St. Stephen. His wife was Gisela. He made Hungary a Christian nation. So welcome to all those. Because in some ways, this feast today, St. Elizabeth of Hungary, is the third such saint from Hungary in the past week. So St. Martin of Tours was born in Hungary, in Pannonia, but then did most of his work as he became the Bishop of Tours in France. And then St. Margaret of Scotland, November 16th, was in exile from England, was born in Hungary. Her mother was Hungarian. Then she became the Queen of Scotland. And so in some ways it's fitting that Elizabeth, whom we celebrate today, was born in Hungary in 1207, but only lived there for 4 years before she went to Germany, to Thuringia, and lived out the rest of her short life, the rest of her 20 years. She died at the age of 24 in Germany. So a lot of Hungarian connections. So let's begin with, see if I can walk around a little bit. So Elizabeth she was a princess. She was born in Hungary to King Andrew II, King Andreas II, and his wife Gertrude. Do I have a pointer? It's like I'm back in the classroom. So her father was the king of Hungary. Her mother comes from the powerful Andechs-Moran family this is from a German map. So this is Bavaria, Bayern. Her husband-to-be comes from Thuringia, and their castle, the Wartburg, is in Thuringia. So this is in the middle of Germany. So something about the family tree. So this is her mother and father, Andrew and Gertrude. Gertrude comes from a very powerful family. One name you might recognize up here is Saint Hedwig. October 16th is her feast day. Gertrude's brother Egbert becomes the Bishop of Bamberg. She has another brother who becomes a patriarch in the church. Very powerful figures. Her husband, Ludwig IV, or Louis IV, comes from this side over in Germany. Just some people to keep in mind. Elizabeth, her brother, King of Hungary, has several children. Kunigunde, Jolenta, and Margarita are all blessed. The SEL is selig, in German for blessed. So they're all blessed in the church. And then through a half relation, her grandniece, Elizabeth of Portugal, or Isabella, her feast day is July 4th or 5th, saint in Portugal. So a lot of, and her own daughter, Elizabeth had 3 children, her own daughter becomes blessed. So a lot of saints, but we also see, just like in the family trees of Jesus in the Gospels, Matthew and Luke, there are lots of saints and sinners in those lists. And we'll talk about why a lot of people didn't like Gertrude. So she's going to go to Thuringia. The Wartburg Castle is in Eisenach, the Geburtsstadt, the birth city of Bach. So this is the castle as it is today. I was able to make a pilgrimage here in 2007, the 800th anniversary of her birth. It's on a very tall hill. This is what it looked like in 1200. All those other buildings weren't there, just the main palace where they lived in this tower. So that's the outside of the tower looking at it. Or there's the tower, there's the palace. That's from the inside. And on the top floor was this hall for performances. And there were Ludwig's father, Ehrman, was very liberal supporter of the arts. And he would have what are called the Minnesingers. They're the German version of troubadours. In German, the word Minne, M-I-N-N-E, is their word for love and courtly love. And so you'd have these singers that would come, and they would have these contests. And famously, there's this contest that took place of these 5 Minnesingers. 4 of them extolled the virtues of their patron, Hermann. The other, Leopold of Austria. He didn't somehow fit in, so they kind of kicked him out. So one of the famous Minnesingers of the 13th century was Walter von der Vogelweide, Walter of the Bird Meadow. This is a statue from Innsbruck. But probably the most famous of them all was Wolfram von Eschenbach, who died around the year 1217, considered the greatest poet of medieval Germany. And he composed Parzival. Now, there's different versions of Parzival. You may know this. It's the story of the Holy Grail in this Arthurian legend. And there's, so Wolfram's version, the Grail has not yet become what it will develop to be as the chalice that Christ used at the Last Supper, or in other traditions, the cup that Joseph of Arimathea used to catch the blood of Christ as it fell from him as he hung on the cross. It was still for him a gemstone, but it received all its power from a wafer that a dove brought from heaven every Good Friday. So there are very much Christian overtones to it. But the story of the Holy Grail, right? It's from this Grail would come forth endless food and drink. You would possess eternal life. And Parzival goes to the castle where the Grail is, and it's under the custody of Anfortis. And Anfortis, right, there's this palace, and there's beautiful maidens and beautiful dresses, and there's gold and silver vessels. And in the midst of all that, Parzival forgets to ask his host, Anfortis, a question. He's supposed to ask him a question, and he forgets all that. And so he returns a second time, and what he asked him is not a question that you need a PhD in theology or a master's in aquatic ecology to know. Right, it's a question that anybody can answer. And the question is basically, do you recognize the people that you're around? Are you attentive to them? Because what he ends up asking Anfortis is, why do you suffer so? Anfortis suffers greatly. But most of the time, Parzival couldn't see that, just as many of us can't, right? We're caught up in our own activities and lives, and how much do we really look at another and look into their eyes and look into their heart even? And so I think that this story of Parzival and the Grail is ultimately a story about mercy. Mercy is, as St. Thomas Aquinas defends it, right? He was born when Elizabeth was 19 or so. And he says the greatest virtue related to our neighbor, and which is also the chief manifestations of God's very omnipotence, is misericordia. It's the Latin for what we translate as mercy, a miserable heart, a suffering heart. Right, that this virtue, and it's also a passion, you're moved with compassion for the suffering of another, that you want to relieve it, to respond with generosity to help. That's misericordia. And that's the life that Elizabeth led in this final instantiation of this year of mercy that ends tomorrow. Now, that doesn't mean God's mercy ends tomorrow, but the church's celebration of and all its benefits that you accrue from it ends tomorrow. But Elizabeth is one who truly saw the other with eyes of love and mercy. So what do we know about Elizabeth? There's two main sources for her life. She had a rather severe spiritual director, Conrad of Marburg, and I'll talk a little bit about him. Elizabeth dies November 17th, in the early morning of November 17th, 1231. On August 10th, the feast of St. Lawrence, Conrad is giving a homily, he's preaching, and he's moved to call people that are there to come up and bear witness to what they have experienced of Elizabeth. And so depositions are taken, and so sometime after August 11th, so August 11th to sometime in October, he sends a letter to Pope Gregory IX, talking about the life of St. Elizabeth, along with 60 accounts of miracles that people attribute to Elizabeth after she died. So that's a first-person account of the life of Elizabeth. He was with her from 1226 to 1231 when she died. The Pope gets this, and then he calls for two different depositions to be taken, more thorough with proper notations and such. And so on January 1st, 1235, in the freezing cold, hundreds of people come and testimonies are taken, but also 4 people that were very close to Elizabeth, 2 of her ladies in waiting, her friends that were with her during her life, and then 2 others that were with her after her husband died and she moved to Marburg. We'll talk about that. And they gave first witness accounts of her life. So this dicta, the sayings of the four servants. Caesar of Heisterbach takes the dicta and adds to it a couple years, 2 years later, and then Dietrich of Apolda writes the life of Elizabeth toward the end of the 13th century. And the further we get away from those original sources, the writings become a little more fanciful, one might say. So I think with Dietrich we can say these things might be possible, but we'd have to try and verify their truth. Her husband, Ludwig, had a chaplain, and he wrote a work in 1228, and then almost a century later, 80 years later, there's the life of Ludwig, the Vita Ludovici, was written, that again takes on more legendary characteristics. So I'm going to be focusing on the first 2 sources for most of this talk. So these are first-hand accounts of what actually happened in the life of Elizabeth. So she was born in Hungary, 1207. We don't know exactly when. Perhaps July 7th is an estimate in the castle Saro-Spatak. Word of this reaches Germany, and so Ehrman, Ludwig's father, sends the knight Walter Vergila to Hungary to ask Elizabeth's father, Andrew, to arrange a marriage between their 2 children. So the knight returns to Germany with the affirmative response. the night then goes back to Hungary, and he accompanies Elizabeth from Hungary to Thuringia. So it's little Elizabeth. She's 4 years old when she leaves her home. She will never see her mother again. She will see her father again, because after she's married, they'll return to Hungary, but she won't see her mother again. Very amazing dowry that was sent, including even a silver bathtub is what is claimed. She arrives at the Wartburg Castle and is there ceremonially wedded to Ludwig at this young age, though they won't be married till sometime later. So Guda and Isentrude were her maids, and Guda accompanied Elizabeth. When Guda was 5, she accompanied Elizabeth then for the rest of Elizabeth's life. And she gives the account that even at a young age, Elizabeth was very zealous in her religion as a child. At 5, still unable to read, she would lie down in front of the altar and open the psalter as if praying. And she would practice genuflections in secret, and she took every opportunity that she could to sneak into the chapel at the Wartburg Castle. She'd be watched by her handmaids, but she'd run and, as if playing a game and trying to catch a girl, and she'd suddenly leap inside the chapel and dedicate herself in prayer before the altar, with knees bent and hands folded, mouth touching the floor. Obeying the rules of the game, she'd be jumping on one foot and chase other girls to the chapel, and if unable to enter, she would at least kiss the church door and its walls. She'd play the game of rings, and she'd placed her hope of winning in God and promised God many genuflections and Ave Marias if she were successful. And if unable to perform these acts secretly, she would say to another girl, "Let's measure ourselves to see who is taller." And in the process of lying down, she could perform many genuflections. If she was compelled to go to bed before completion of her prayers, she would stay awake in her bed and finish. Everything that she did, she would always, even from a young age, she would always practice some kind of penance, some kind of penitence to take something away for the sake of God, to break her own will for God's sake. So one time when she won a game, she said, "Now at the height of my success, I will, for God's sake, stop playing." And other girls would perform many rounds of dances, and after having completed only one, she said, "One is enough for me. I will dispense with the rest for God's sake." And she did many other things like this. In 1213, so Elizabeth is 6 years old at this time, her mother Gertrude is murdered. She's from Bavaria. She marries the Queen of Hungary. She's disliked because of that by many Hungarians. They didn't like this foreign influence in Hungary. But she was also detested as a queen. She was very power hungry. Her husband was rather incompetent as the king. She's really the one who had all the power. But the king was very wasteful and extravagant in with the country's money. So conspirators wanted somebody else to take over the throne. And so most likely on September 28th in 1213, political opponents murdered her. So back to the Wartburg Castle. Let's talk about the relationship with Ludwig, her husband. This is a picture for the 800th anniversary of her birth in 2007. They put on a musical over in Germany. So this is a shot from the booklet of Elizabeth with Ludwig. And this will be very important, the relationship, what we know about her relationship. So part of one of those papal commissions in 1223, 2 years after her death, there's a woman who testified that she was on her way to the shrine of Elizabeth in Marburg, hoping to have her eyesight restored. One of her eyes she couldn't see. And along the way, she heard men singing in German about the tearful goodbye between Elizabeth and her husband, who was about to set out for the Crusades, for the Sixth Crusade. And so this blind woman is moved to tears by hearing this. But it's evidence that sometime between the death of her husband in 1227 and January of 1233, that marriage had left its mark on the German Minnesinger tradition. That so well known was this relationship of love between them. So Elizabeth would often get up from bed at night to go and pray. Her husband would beg her not to afflict herself so, and sometimes he would take one of her hands in his for as long as she would pray beside him outside of the bed, asking her to come back, concerned about her discomfort. And Elizabeth would ask one of her maidservants, usually Isntrud, to come and wake her up in the middle of the night so she could go and pray. And the way that she would do this is that she would tug on one of the toes of Elizabeth. Well, one night, his leg was over hers, and so she pulls on his toe and wakes him up. But despite being awakened, he bore it patiently, she said, knowing what she was trying to do. When asked about why she did this, why not going back to bed to sleep with her husband, she says, although I may not be capable of praying incessantly without ceasing, I'm still doing battle with my flesh by tearing away from my beloved husband. Everything about their relationship points to an amazing, even though arranged marriage, a truly loving marriage. So the maids testify that she lived with Ludwig in marriage in a manner worthy of praise. They loved each other with wonderful affection, sweetly inviting and encouraging each other to praise and serve God. When, due to some temporal necessity, they wrote, Elizabeth's husband had to tend to some matter related to the rules, so he'd often be leaving the Wartburg Castle to attend to matters of state. But he not only quietly held the fear of God before his eyes, but he gave a free hand to Blessed Elizabeth for carrying out everything that pertained to the honor of God and thus contributing to the salvation of her soul. So it's an indication that he agreed completely with everything that she did. And what did she do? She tended to the poor, the hungry, the sick. This was a time where there's great wealth among the clergy and powerful noblemen in the church. This is the time of St. Francis of Assisi. St. Francis was born in 1180. He dies in 1226, the year that Elizabeth is married. I'm sorry, that's not true. She was married 5 years before that. So 5 years after she was married is when he dies. And St. Francis embraced this life of poverty. And he also had a particular relationship with lepers. They were repulsive to him in his earlier life, but after his conversion, right, he embraces lepers and he kisses their sores. He cleansed their bodies and dressed their wounds and treated them as human beings. And he would refuse to flee from them in horror, as most people did. That what was once ugly and repulsive to Francis now became a cause of delight and joy. The Franciscans spread throughout Europe. By 1220, Francis dies in 1226. In 1220, there were 5,000 Franciscans. In 1250, there were 30,000. There's a movement afoot. A very famous instance for Elizabeth deals with a leper. Gouda or Isntrud relate that she secretly took in a sick beggar who was horrendous in appearance, suffering from a skin disease on his head, and with her own hands she trimmed his horrid locks with head in her lap. She washed his head in an out-of-the-way place beyond the walls, wanting to keep him out of sight. And when she was reproached by others of the council for this, she would just laugh. There's an amazing joy that permeated the life of Elizabeth. In 1226, her husband is away preparing for the Crusades, and there's a famine that breaks out in Germany. She distributes grain from 4 major granaries, major barns that her husband had, right, to give alms to the poor. At the base of the castle, the remains of there's a fountain there, but there's also a 28-person hospital that she set up to care for the sick. She cheerfully tended to the people with her own hands, right? She would wipe the saliva and mucus from their faces and filth from their mouths and noses of the sick. She had a great care for the children. They would call her mother. And she had a special devotion, especially those who were the mangy the disabled, the weak, and the dirty, and the deformed, as her maid said. Now, to get to this fountain, to get to this, remember, this is a very tall place where the Wartburg is. You can see it high up on the hill. And twice a day, morning and evening, she would walk up and down from the castle down to the hospital. Right? It was not without effort. On Holy Thursday or Maundy Thursday, right, the command of Christ to do as I have done, she would do, and she would gather lepers on Holy Thursday, consoling them and exhorting them to patience, and she was no more horrified by them than she was by healthy people. Right? Again, kind of this parallel with St. Francis. She would dress very simply, and she encouraged the other ladies of her peers to do that. Conrad of Marburg, a priest from Mainz. He was learned and scholarly. He was irreproachable in his life. He despised riches. He became a preacher for the Crusades, the 5th and 6th Crusades, and he became also a preacher against heresies. Right? He was well known by 3 different popes. And Ludwig proposes Conrad as Elizabeth's confessor and later spiritual director. But Conrad, though his great love of poverty, didn't have the joy that Francis and Elizabeth had. Now, one of the things that he commanded her to do was not to eat anything that was obtained unjustly in terms of food or drink, because this was common at the times for the noblemen to take things from the peasants without adequately compensating them. So oftentimes she and her maids would follow her in this. Sometimes she could eat but not drink. Sometimes they could drink but not eat. And sometimes if she could do both, she'd clap her hands and say, "We get to eat and drink today." Her husband let her do this without complaint. And he said, "I would do this myself if I did not fear being slandered by members of my own household and others. Lord willing, I will soon be able to arrange things differently with regard to my position." Right? So the influence of the noblemen kept him from following Elizabeth in this kind of witness. Ludwig he's heading out in 1227 for the 6th Crusade. He makes it as far as, it's just this very tearful goodbye, right, that people would sing about shortly thereafter. He dies on a ship just off the coast of Italy on September 11th, 1227. After he dies, Elizabeth, who was always in some ways disliked by at least her brother-in-law, is forced out of the castle. So this is her being pushed out of the castle. And there are many depictions of this in art, leaving the castle. The first night she leaves without her children, but then her children will come to her, and not many people will take her in. It's kind of like Mary and Joseph trying to find a place at the inn. So she finds room in a pigsty down in Eisenach, but the noble people are reluctant to take her in. So eventually, when she's in Eisenach, she makes a vow on Good Friday, March 24th, 1228, and becomes, in essence, a third order Franciscan. And she follows Conrad to Marburg. And there she sets up a hospital where she continues her work. And there's account after account of what she does. And what I want to do is just focus on a couple things. Because we've seen instances of her active life. And I just want to say something about her contemplative life. Conrad himself, in his letter to the Pope, says, "I have rarely seen a more contemplative woman. Religious men and women often saw her face when she was returning from one of her prayer retreats, shining wonderfully as if rays of sun were emanating from her eyes. If, as was often the case, she was caught up in rapture for several hours, she would sustain herself with very little food, if any at all, for the longest time." One account that her maids tell in their deposition in 1233, 1235, is of Gertrude of Leimbach, who comes to visit her in Marburg. Actually, this is the monastery of Werda. And there's a young man, Berthold, who accompanies her. And Elizabeth takes one look at this dapper dandy who's dressed in a worldly manner and says to him, "You seem to be living your life less discreetly than you ought. Why do you not serve the Creator?" Berthold says, "Oh, my lady, I beg you, pray for me so that the Lord will give me his grace for serving him." "Do you really want me to pray for you?" "I most certainly do." "It is fitting that you prepare yourself for receiving this grace by praying while I pray for you at the same time." And so they're separated. They're some distance apart, I think in different rooms. And they're both praying. And after a time, Berthold shouts out, "Oh, my lady, stop praying." But she continues with greater zeal. He cries out even more loudly, "My lady, stop your praying, for I am growing weak." Indeed, the youth was burning with heat and perspiring and even steaming, as he threw his arms and his entire body about here and there as if he were demented. So Gertrude had to come with him, and Elizabeth, this handmaid, and Irmgard, who testified to these events under oath, all rushed in and held him. And they found him, as Lady Elizabeth herself said they would, to be hot to the touch, with his clothes drenched with sweat, repeating, "In the name of the Lord, I beg you to stop praying, because I'm being consumed by fire." Indeed, those people who were holding him could barely stand the touch of the heat. And as soon as she stopped praying, he felt better. They said this happened a year before her death. So after her death, this young man, Berthold, entered the Franciscans. But the maid said this kind of thing happened frequently to those on whose behalf Elizabeth prayed. Should I ask that she pray for all of us? What would change? I do want to talk about her cheerfulness, her disposition. Because in all the accounts that the maids tell, it's always she did this cheerfully, she did this with great joy. And this account of this scene here is that she would, when she was in Marburg, she would often give alms and help out this old, sick beggar woman. But one time, Elizabeth is on her way to church in a small village, and as she was making her way across some stones, here it's a little bridge, that had positioned to help people get over the mud, this woman was unwilling to let Elizabeth pass, and so she pushes Elizabeth into the mud. But the maid said that Elizabeth bore this patiently, and she got up laughing and washed her clothes with joy. She wanted the people that she fed and to whom she gave shoes and clothes and tools by which they could get work. She says, I want to fill them with joy. And seeing the joy on people's faces, right, she herself was overjoyed with their reaction. The maids say that always she spoke to us with words full of joy, calling us her loved ones and her friends. The death of Elizabeth, she anticipated. Conrad had come to her saying that, "I'm very ill and I don't think I'm going to live much longer." She says, "Well, I'm not going to live even that long." And so the maids and Conrad themselves give this account of her life, and that they heard this amazing sweet melody that was coming from her throat. And Elizabeth said, "I tell you, a little bird situated between me and the wall was singing most joyfully to me. Inspired by its voice, it seemed fitting for me to sing along." And so in the last hours of her life, she had cast away all the rich and powerful people that wanted to come to see her, and she's just surrounded by the poor and these maids and Conrad. And at one point she claims, "Now let us speak about God and the child Jesus," because now it's midnight, right? This was the night of the 16th into the morning of the 17th, because now it's midnight, right? We celebrate midnight mass at midnight because in the book of Wisdom it talks about the word of God descending in the middle of the night in relationship to the Exodus, and that's applied to Jesus' birth, right? It's midnight when Jesus was born and rested in the manger and created a new star with his great power, a star which no one had ever seen before. And she remained most joyful, speaking about such things as if she were not even sick. And then she passed away peacefully she died peacefully in her sleep. So, one thing that I haven't talked about in all of this, right? And people came from near and far when they learned of her death. A year after her death, her remains were translated to a church that had been built. The Emperor, Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, was there. After the death of her husband, her uncle, if you remember Otto, the Bishop of Bamberg, very powerful bishop, kind of kidnapped her in a sense and kept her in his palace in Pottenstein and had thoughts of marrying her off to Frederick II. But Elizabeth had made this vow, right, on Good Friday in 1228, that she would never marry again, that she would be chaste the rest of her life. So Frederick II is there and helps in this translation of her remains from where she had been buried to the church in Marburg. Now, one thing that's missing from this story, there's the church as it is. By the end of the 13th century, this church had been built in Marburg. Her remains are there. But what's missing from this account of the life of Elizabeth? If you know anything about Elizabeth of Hungary, what haven't I talked about? The loaves of bread. So in the castle in the Wartburg are these depictions of the 7 corporal works of mercy, right? So Elizabeth feeding the hungry, giving drink to the thirsty, clothing the naked. What's this one? Sheltering the homeless, right? Visiting the sick, visiting those in prison, and burying the dead. She would often provide clothing for those who had died, right? So they could be buried in something. And she was also someone who, as she would care for people's physical needs, she was also encouraging people to baptize their children or to go to confession, right? To get their spiritual life in order. But I haven't said anything about the miracle of the roses. So the story goes like this. Her husband has commanded her not to go out to the poor and not to bring food, right? It's too much of a burden on the castle resources. But she disobeys that, and she's carrying this bread with her maids, these loaves of bread, out into the world to feed the hungry. And he comes upon her unexpectedly and says, "My beloved, what do you have there?" And she says, "See for yourself." And as he withdraws her cloak, there are roses. So this is from the basilica here. It's the last window on the right side of the nave. It's the first window, just before you get to the transept on the east. Right, that's the small picture below it, is her and Ludwig. So over and over again, these are just different cathedrals in the U.S. that have depictions of Elizabeth and the roses. You can see this is what people depict of Elizabeth. In any of the sources, Conrad and the 4 handmaids, they never mention this event. It doesn't mean it didn't happen. They just didn't mention it. But if you're giving a deposition for the canonization of your princess, wouldn't you mention this? Because they do mention the miraculous things that they do mention is that one time she was distributing food and there was a vessel of beer, and that vessel never ran dry as she fed and gave drink to all those people. Or this event of Berthold, right, who's praying when she prays for him. They tell that story, which there seems to be something going on there, right? But they don't mention this. The earliest report we have of this isn't until the end of the 13th century. So it's not found in any of the authentic documents. And even if you remember Dietrich of Apolda, that last source on that list from the late 13th century, who's given more to things that can be more legendary, he himself doesn't mention it. Now, this miracle is given with other saints as well, one of which is with her grandniece, Elizabeth of Portugal, whose husband was a rogue, right? He had lots of adulterous affairs, and Isabella would raise those children. So perhaps it makes more sense with her great niece. That doesn't mean it didn't happen, but everything we know about Ludwig and Elizabeth is that they had an amazingly wonderful, mutually reverential relationship. And so it doesn't fit with Ludwig's character that he would so prohibit her from doing things. He agreed with everything that she did. So I'll leave it to, we don't know, but would it make a difference if it didn't happen with everything else that she did do? Here's the Cathedral of Our Lady of the Rosary in Toledo, Ohio. And you can see this in the apse. There's this amazing picture of the communion of the saints. And in the corner, here is Elizabeth, again with the roses. I think what we learn from, as this year of mercy comes to a close, and this year of the year of the saints of mercy comes to a close with the Institute for Church Life, is how do we live a life of mercy that our Lord lived, Jesus Christ, who was mercy himself, and the saints lived. And I think the true norm of humanity is sainthood. What do I mean by that? It doesn't mean that norm being statistically most people are saints, but the norm being the standard by which we measure something is sainthood. Right? Those are the holy men and women. The saints are those men and women who see aright. They have the right perspective by which to see not only God, but truly one another. Elizabeth would talk about when she would tend to the sick, how wonderful it is to treat our Lord so. Right? It's Matthew 25. Whatever you do to the least of my brothers and sisters, you do to me. So this 13th century saint who humbled herself and prostrated herself before lepers and washed their feet and carried out this mandatum of Holy Thursday that shocked and scandalized her peers. I think she is who we look to as a norm of humanity. This is what is normal. And so it's abnormal to be doing otherwise than looking at our brothers and sisters without love and mercy. And I think with that, I will end my talk and open it up for questions for the last 10 minutes. Thank you. Questions? Yes.
Hi, I really enjoyed the talk. Thank you. I was wondering, you mentioned that she was kicked out of the castle with her 3 children, and I was just wondering if you have an idea of what happened to her children.
Okay, good question. So in the longer version of this talk, I can go back to this. So she had 3 children. So she was married at the age of 14. Ludwig was 20. Ludwig dies in 1227, so Elizabeth is 20 when her husband dies. So she's a widow. She's a patroness of widows. So the first child, Herman, is born in 1222. Where's Herman? Where's her child? Okay. So Herman II, 1222, he becomes the Landgraf, the prince of Thuringia, and dies childless. Sophie, born in 1224, March 1224, marries the Duke, the Herzog of Brabant, and they get into, there's actually some civil wars that develop between her child and somebody over here. And then the third child, Gertrude, she was pregnant with Gertrude when her husband died. Her husband died on September 11th. Gertrude was born September 28th, 29th of that same month. So Herman never stayed in the castle. Gertrude was given to a monastery of sisters, and she becomes that abbess and becomes Blessed Gertrude of the Premonstratensians. So there's debate about it is probably true that she was unwelcome at at the castle. But also I think it's a place that she didn't want to be anymore. Because she wanted to live this life of Christ. She wanted to be a poor beggar like Francis. And so on 1228 on Good Friday, when she made those vows, she renounced her nobility, her parentage, her children, all her possessions. So she herself divests herself of her children, which can be very difficult, right, for 21st century people to think. Mothers in the room might think, well, but that's something she experienced herself, right, when she was young. But I think the life that she wanted to live wasn't compatible with raising her children, so gave them over to others who could. So that's what happened to her. That's what happened to her children. Yes?
This is pre-Reformation and the different branches of Reformation in Germany. Is she revered by any other Christians in Hungary?
So the question is, this is pre-Reformation in Germany, and is she reverenced by others outside the Catholic Church? So the Wartburg Castle, if anybody knows your Protestant Reformation history, this is where Luther goes and flees and is under the protection of is it Frederick? So this is where Luther writes the Bible, translates it into German. It takes place in the Wartburg Castle. There's new buildings that have been built since Elizabeth. And the Marburg Church, her shrine, is a Lutheran church now. I'm not sure, Luther knew of her, certainly, and would write about her, but I'm not sure of what kind of veneration the people in the Protestant church give, particularly Lutherans, would give to Elizabeth. That I don't know. I don't know if you do you know. Would you be able to answer that any better? Hands. Let's see. Yes.
You said in the beginning that one of her aunts was a saint as well.
Right, Saint Hedwig.
Did she ever know her?
That's a good question. There's somebody else I forgot to mention. So if you remember, when did Hedwig die? So Hedwig dies in 1243. So I suspect they would have known of each other. Now, here Andrew has some brothers. And Andrew's brother has a daughter named Agnes of Prague. So if you know anything about St. Clare, she would write, we have accounts of 4 letters that St. Clare wrote to Blessed Agnes of Prague. So that's Elizabeth's first cousin, is Agnes of Prague. We know that St. Francis wrote a letter to Elizabeth. We don't have it anymore, but there's evidence that he did write one to her. So I don't know the relationship, what kind of contact what she would have had with St. Hedwig. Yes?
I heard once of a prayer that St. Elizabeth said about the death of her husband. I want to know if that's a famous prayer, if it was true, or if you know anything about that. Something about that she wouldn't, if it wasn't God's will, she wouldn't bring him back for one Our Father.
Hold on. So, the question was, I've heard of a prayer that's attributed to Elizabeth on the death of her husband's and there is such a statement that she did make, if I can find it in the right pile. Here it is. So when she was held captive by her evil uncle, the Bishop of Bamberg, in some ways she threatened to cut off her nose so she wouldn't get married to Frederick II, so she would be so hideous. But what rescued her is that the bones of her dead husband are being brought back to be buried in the Reinhardsbrunn monastery. And so she accompanies them and can escape from the bishop. And she says this. And this is what her maids say. Lord, thank you for mercifully consoling me with the much desired bones of my husband. You know that no matter how much I loved him, a man whom you also loved, I did not begrudge the sacrifice made by him and by me in support of the Holy Land, right, the Crusades. But if I could have him back, I would choose him over the entire world, ready to go off begging with him forever. But with you as my witness, I would not wish to redeem his life, not even one hair, against your will. Now I command both of us to your grace. May thy will be done. So that's the... Yes?
Since Elizabeth was basically raised since 4 years old in the household of Ehrman and Sophie, as was Ludwig, I imagine,
Mhm.
they were both so holy. What do we know about their household? It seems like it was very devoted.
So what do we know about the household where Elizabeth was raised in Thuringia in the Wartburg Castle? Sophie herself was very religious and devout. Her husband, now this was the age where excommunications were thrown around rather liberally. And so her father-in-law died under the ban of excommunication. So we're not sure, and a lot of that has to do with your political rivals and those kind of things. So we know that Sophie was very devout. Ludwig himself was devout, and they were, right, he had siblings as well. Heinrich Hermann, or Conrad becomes the head of the Order of the Teutonic Knights, this religious community that takes over the cause of canonization for Elizabeth and builds the church in Marburg. So she was raised in a very pious household. Now this doesn't come from the two major sources, it comes from Dietrich, I think. And some of that can present antipathy between Elizabeth and Sophia, but I think sometimes that gets created to have some conflict of why she might have been kicked out of the castle. But I think Sophie went in after the death of her husband, right? So after the death of Herman in 1217, she retired to a monastery and lived this life of simplicity in her days there. Yes?
Yeah, just wondering, you said early on there were like 60 miracles very quickly. Can you comment about some of the miracles?
Right, so there's this wonderful book called The Life and Afterlife of St. Elizabeth of Hungary, Testimony from Her Canonization Hearings by Kenneth Baxter Wolfe. In the two papal commissions, there were 130 miracles that were listed. And somewhere I had at least just the percentages of what, some were restoring sight to people's eyes, or, you know, when you get the big pile up here, where does it go? There's actually some testimonies of raising people from the dead, but a lot of it's dealing with like epilepsy, eyesight, lameness, madness, some mental illnesses. It is so 130 cures. Those with impaired mobility, lameness, paralysis, 50% of the cures were those. Blindness, 18%. Epilepsy, 11%. Mental limitations, either insanity or madness, 4%. And even raising people thought to be dead, 6%. So those are some of them. One final question to... Yes?
Why is your feast day different in the United States versus Europe?
Why is it different in Europe versus the United States? That's a good question. Now, I think I have two possible reasons for this. One has to do with, there are different feast days. So the feast of, is the visitation, right? So here it's what, it's May 31st, around May 31st, right? In Europe, it's July 2nd. So there are just other dates that are different. I think it might have something to do with, so on November 17th here in the US, we celebrate Elizabeth of Hungary. On the 16th, we do Margaret of Scotland and Gertrude. The 17th in Germany is St. Gertrude, who is from Thuringia herself. So it could be that Gertrude has a more stake there, and so Elizabeth gets booted. Or I have the German translation of the Canonization promulgation. And in it, surprisingly, it says in the canonization document from Pope Gregory IX, gestorben am 19. November, died on the 19th of November. But how can you, because we know when she died from Conrad, he talks about she died on the he doesn't say specifically the 17th, but you can get to it by, it's the certain day of the, it was the feast of, on the octave of St. Martin. Martin is the 11th, the octave would be the 18th. She was sick on the Sunday before, and she died that Sunday, Monday, so we know it's 1617 in this octave of St. Martin. So we know she died on the 17th, so I'm not really sure why, but it could be that either from the papal document, and there's a mistake in that the 19th took precedence in Europe, or it might have something to do with when the feast day of St. Gertrude is that gets Elizabeth moved around. So I think that's...
So friends, we've come to the end of the hour. Please help yourself to coffee and hot chocolate and cookies on your way out. And we are also giving away Advent calendars. Advent will start next weekend. This is taken from the window of the engineering school chapel. So please help yourself to an Advent calendar as well. They are on the back table over here. And we have one remaining duty to thank our speaker once again.